Okay, welcome. See if our microphone works. Testing 1, 2, 3. Well, it seems to work, so we'll begin. 9th of August, Dis and Dat Information. We're continuing on with Alyssa Battistoni's new book, Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Nature, Chapter 6. Planet Making, Nature as Capital. On September 26, 1991, outside Tucson, Arizona, 8 people dressed in bright red jumpsuits locked themselves inside a 3-acre steel and glass dome filled with over 3,000 species of animals and plants, not to emerge for 2 full years. They planned to show that the structure, known as Biosphere 2, was capable of sustaining life while completely sealed off from Biosphere 1, that is, the Earth. A successful project would act as a prototype for sustaining life on other planets, or on the Earth itself in the event of a nuclear winter. Amid Biosphere 2's 7 biomes, desert, rainforest, savanna, marsh, ocean, city, farm, the biospherians would grow their own food and conduct research. As on Biosphere 1, they would rely on plants and animals to produce oxygen and absorb carbon dioxide, fertilize the soil, and consume waste. But whereas on Biosphere 1, atmospheric and oceanic processes circulated carbon, water, waste, and nutrients, within Biosphere 2, that work was mechanized. Beneath the rainforest and desert landscape was a massive technosphere comprising 3 acres of electrical, mechanical, and plumbing systems intended, as one biospherian put it, to replicate many of Earth's free services. Machines powered by diesel generators desalinated water and treated wastewater, created breezes and ocean waves, heated and cooled the air. Biosphere 2 was, as one inhabitant called it, the Garden of Eden on top of an aircraft carrier. Life in Biosphere 2, however, was not Edenic. Soon after the dome was sealed, as many as 30% of species died off, including all pollinators, leading to an explosion of ants and cockroaches. Oxygen levels dropped precipitously, while carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide rose to dangerous levels. It later turned out that microbes in the soil produced carbon dioxide faster than plants could absorb it, while the structure's concrete foundations absorbed more oxygen than expected. Biosphere 2 most obviously demonstrated a core principle of ecology, that human survival depends on many other forms of life. Biosphere 1 was clearly much more complicated than anyone had imagined, but the true lesson of Biosphere 2, the biologist John Avise argued, was an economic one. It had made it possible to construct a more explicit ledger of the Earth's free services. It had cost over $150 million to keep 8 humans alive for 2 years in Biosphere. As Avise pointed out, these services are provided to the rest of us more or less cost-free by natural processes, but if we were being charged, the total invoice for all Earthospherians would come to an astronomical $3 quintillion for the current generation alone. A few years later, a group of scientists would look to Biosphere 2 in producing a more precise estimate. The services provided by Earth's biosphere, they calculated, were worth approximately $33 trillion, about twice world GDP at the time. Relative to the cost of Biosphere 2, they concluded Biosphere 1, that is the Earth, is a very efficient, least cost provider of human life support services. Footnote 4. In classical political economy, natural agents appear as contributors to production. Conventionally understood, sheep's viscera help produce wool, wind drives the sails of merchant ships, fertile soil helps crops grow. But each of these is dependent on countless others that go unmentioned. Soil is produced by countless worms, fungi, mites, and other insects, which decompose organic debris and transfer nutrients between plants. Bacteria in the sheep's gut help the sheep digest grass. Bees pollinate those plants the sheep eat. Plants capture solar energy and convert it to a form the sheep can process, which brings us back to the soil. Even the wind wouldn't blow in the same way without temperature patterns linked to global climate regulation, itself maintained by a complex array of living systems. These natural agents don't go directly into commodity production, but they regenerate the ones that do. More than that, they constitute Earth's life support systems, the carbon cycle, water purification, soil fertility, and other elements which make the planet habitable. Thus, Anna Tsing argues, making worlds is not limited to humans. Rather, all organisms make ecological living places, altering earth, air, and water. These multi-species activities are more than world-making. They are planet-making. The actions and interactions of various life forms, from amoebas to sequoia, have over millions of years shaped Earth's very geology and atmosphere so significantly as to make a qualitatively different kind of planet than Mars or Venus. These planet-making abilities, however, are currently in serious decline. We are currently damaging the natural world so profoundly that many of its natural systems are now on the verge of breakdown. David Attenborough warns, warning signs have long been on the horizon. In 1973, amid debates about resource scarcity and the limits to growth, the economist William Nordhaus noted in a piece otherwise refuting ecological doomsaying that if the price system malfunctions, as is currently the case for free but scarce public environmental resources, then perverse outcomes are possible. See Steve Keen. 5 decades later, this malfunction persists, and perverse outcomes have materialized. The value of natural entities such as mangroves, wetlands, and coral reefs, the economist Partha Dasgupta observes, lies in their contributions to human well-being, which don't appear in the marketplace. Footnote 9. As the ecologist Gretchen Daly argues, the disparity between actual and perceived value is probably nowhere greater than in the case of ecosystem services. Footnote 10. 2 common strategies for rectifying this disparity have emerged. The first strategy proposes to price nature, often described in terms of quote-unquote natural capital or quote-unquote ecosystem services, in recognition of ecosystems' economic contributions. It is exemplified by a statement by Henry Paulson, former Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, and now a staunch advocate for natural capital valuation. Quote, people assume that natural capital is a free good, and if you don't put a value in it, they will value it as zero. Close quote. Like it or not, this position holds. Goods are assessed in terms of the monetary value. If nature is to be protected, it must have a price. Its use and exchange value must be brought more closely into alignment, whether by requiring payment for ecosystem services, accounting for natural capital, or creating markets in natural assets. Footnote 12. The goal, in the words of the biologist Edward O. Wilson, is to give the invisible hand of free market economics a green thumb. Footnote 13. The second strategy, a moral critique that insists on nature's pricelessness, has developed in vehement opposition to the first. Critics argue that price is an inappropriate metric for the more than human world. one that degrades or diminishes precisely what it seeks to capture. Some things should not be for sale, they argue, and nature is one of them. Dear neoliberal economist, Andre Gortz asked scornfully in 1983, how much is a ray of sunlight worth? Fresh air without lead or sulfur fumes, footnote 14. Instead of trying to translate the intrinsic, ethical, or aesthetic value of nature into monetary terms, Gortz and others insist we must learn to value nature in ways that can't be costed. Page 182. Advocates of pricing nature correctly identify the problem that in a world of generalized commodity exchange, things without exchange value are treated as worthless. Critics, meanwhile, rightly identify the gap between exchange value and other kinds, indexing a critique of capitalism's form of value, even where capitalism is not invoked directly. Yet, while these strategies to value nature in terms of price or to protect nature from price point in opposite directions, neither has been successful. Efforts to price nature have repeatedly failed to make certain kinds of nature valuable in economic terms, however impoverished those terms may be. Efforts to render nature priceless, meanwhile, have failed to protect it from the market, even as many of nature's gifts remain free. Nature, as we've seen, is a free gift by default. It can't appear in the marketplace in its own right, and it can't demand a wage for its services, however valuable they might be. To have a price, it needs a human representative, which is to say, it needs an owner. And if Western thought has often conceived of nature as a gift from God to all humanity in common, it has just as often defended its appropriation as private property. Nature's gift, for many, is meant to be alienated and owned, worked, and improved. Most obviously, Locke's foundational account of property describes the process of enclosing nature's gifts. The observation that God had given the earth to men in common is for Locke simply a prelude to explaining how an individual might justifiably claim it as his own. The role of labor in making land productive is key to this argument. Land left wholly to nature, Locke argues, is merely waste. Locke's account of ownership conveniently justified the expropriation of land from indigenous peoples of the New World. It also, Marx's charge, concealed the violent appropriation of commons used by English peasants, the process of so-called primitive accumulation, capitalism's original sin, footnote 17. Many of capitalism's other critics have tracked its advancement via the continuing process of enclosure, not least of ever more gifts of nature. Already in the 16th century, Thomas Müntzer, the radical theologian and leader of the German peasant wars, lamented that, quote, all creatures have been turned into property, the fishes in the water, the birds in the air, the plants on the earth, unquote, declaring that, quote, the creatures too must become free, unquote, footnote 18. 4 centuries later, the political scientist James Scott would ruefully describe, quote, the inexorable incorporation of what were once thought of as free gifts of nature, forests, game, wasteland, prairies, subsurface minerals, water and watercourses, air rights, breathable air, and even genetic sequences into a property regime, footnote 19, unquote. It should not be surprised, in other words, to find capital enclosing the gifts of nature. Now, this, after all, is where capital begins. What is surprising, however, and what requires attention is the fact that some gifts remain free, that even today, some indeed, many creatures have not yet been turned into property. If capitalism relentlessly commodifies, why are ecosystem services still valued as zero? Why have some gifts of nature remained free? Capital's failure to enclose these gifts is not for lack of trying, The uncultivated land that Locke dismissed as mere waste is now figured as the site of potentially valuable ecosystem services. The past few decades have seen the proliferation of programs in quote-unquote natural capital accounting and companies purporting to trade in quote-unquote natural assets, proclaiming ecological nature to be a source of untapped value and a corresponding rash of critiques decrying the commodification of life itself. But the gifts of nature described in terms of natural capital and ecosystem services have proved remarkably difficult to make into property. Critics of commodification have misidentified the problem afflicting the biosphere. Not that capital has absorbed all of life, but that it has, as with the last chapter, abdicated responsibility for so much of it. As this chapter shows, ecosystems are ultimately better thought of as infrastructures rather than commodities, as systems that support a range of other activities rather than as discrete goods or services to be exchanged directly. Footnote 20. This perspective on ecosystems reorients attention away from moral debates about commodification and toward political questions. That is, what kinds of work do ecosystems do, and for whom? What kinds of ecosystem public services do we need to make our planet a livable one for humans and non-humans alike? Next section, to price or not to price, nature's economy. Those who study the non-human world have often trumpeted its usefulness for human life, often drawing on the language of economics to illustrate the point. The 19th century naturalist Ernst Haeckel famously coined the term ecology with the word oikos in mind, proposing that the living organisms of the earth constitute a single economic unit resembling a household or family. The 19th century ecologist George Perkins Marsh had observed the services rendered to human beings by various minuscule organisms. Charles Darwin described the offices that different creatures occupied. Rachel Carson wrote of bacteria, fungi, algae, and flies working in sun and rain during the hours of darkness. Footnote 22. When the term ecosystem services per se was first deployed, however, in the 1970 report, Man's Impact on the Global Environment, it was to report their alarming decline. Ecosystems, long thought of as sources of renewable resources, were being exhausted, depleted through overuse, overburdened by pollution, damaged by abstraction, harvested outright. Their destruction, the report warned, threatened to annihilate natural life on the planet together. Footnote 23. Suitably alarmed by this possibility, many ecologists sought to describe ecosystems' contribution to human life in hopes of bringing them to public attention. Economics seemed to many like an effective, if controversial, idiom for conveying nature's usefulness to an ecologically disconnected population. Footnote 24. As the ecological economist Herman Daly wrote in his 1968 Economics as a Life Science, quote, the entire physical environment is capital, since it is only through the agency of air, soil, and water that plant life is able to capture the solar energy upon which the whole hierarchy of life and value depends. Should not these elements receive the same care we bestow upon our other machines? And is not any theory of value that leaves them out like a theory of icebergs that fails to consider the submerged 90%? Footnote 25, close quote. Daly's was one of a flurry of metaphors comparing nature to capital in this period. The economist E.F. Schumacher argued that the capital provided by nature and not by man was being used up rapidly. The agrarianist Wendell Berry described soil fertility as the major capital of any farm. The ecologist Barry Commoner wrote of the biological capital of the ecosphere. Although initially figurative, efforts to represent nature economically became increasingly literal. In the United States, the environmental legislation of the 1970s required assessments of the cost of regulation on industry, driving an early round of efforts to quantify the value of ecosystems. These often generated surprisingly high numbers, footnote 27. They also generated considerable debate. As natural capital moved from metaphor to estimate, disputes raged over how the functions of ecosystems should be defined and assessed. What kind of thing are ecosystem services? And what, for that matter, is value? In enumerating nature's benefits, ecologists have typically focused on anthropocentric use values, detailing the rich variety of ways, both material and immaterial, in which ecosystems contribute to human life, health, and happiness. Rendering these in monetary terms, however, is rarely straightforward. Some services performed by ecosystems can be measured in biophysical terms. It is possible to assess roughly how much carbon a forest stores or how many carcasses a vulture decomposes. But it's not always clear how physical assessments should translate into prices. Even if the value of a single ecosystem service, carcass decomposition, say, can be roughly estimated, the value of the entire ecosystem is much harder to assess since the loss of any one function typically affects others. Still more difficult to quantify are subjective elements like immaterial benefits, for example, aesthetic value, and ethical commitments. What is the beauty of a pristine lake worth? How much does someone value living in a world where a rainforest exists, even if they never visit it? How much would someone pay to prevent the extinction of a species they don't know exists? Can spiritual relationships really be calculated in monetary terms? Are these appropriate ways of assessing moral value at all? Footnote 28. Now, to illustrate these questions, consider the whale. Whales have historically provided many materials useful for commodity production, from blubber rendered into oil to baleen made into corset stays. In some parts of the world, they are a source of food. To some people, they are relations. To others, they are inspiring and beautiful, offering meaning or entertainment. Even those who never see a whale in person may want to know that they're out there somewhere. Still, other contributions come in the course of whales' daily lives, during which they do not interact with human beings at all. Whales circulate nutrients throughout the ocean as they migrate, as well as when they dive to feed and rise to the surface to breathe, contributing to the growth of carbon-storing phytoplankton. Throughout their lives, their bodies accumulate and store carbon, removing it from the atmosphere. Even upon their death, their carcasses provide a food source for many other kinds of marine life. Footnote 29. Economists have painstakingly developed methods for calculating the monetary value of each of these gifts. The value of whales' beauty might be estimated via whale-watching revenues, the value of their existence by how much people are willing to pay for lobster caught with whale-safe traps. The value of whale meat eaten by subsistence hunters can be compared to the cost of purchasing beef. The value of carbon absorption can be calculated in relation to the price of carbon credits. The value of the whale within the ecosystem is trickier, since these services are valuable only in relationship to the whale's broader ecosystem. The phytoplankton it eats, the fish that clean parasites from its skin, the bacteria that help it digest. Calculating any one benefit alone, meanwhile, neglects all the others. In 2020, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, nevertheless estimated the value of a single whale at about $2 million, amounting to $1 trillion for the entire living stock, about a third of the present market capitalization of Apple. Footnote 30. Next section, hostile worlds. To many people, to put a price on a whale seems like a mistake that only the IMF could make. At every point in the development of methods for calculating nature's economic value, beginning with the very earliest cost-benefit assessment, critics have emphasized their limits. Footnote 31. Those opposed to ecosystem pricing tend to argue that nature and the economy belong not only to separate spheres, but to what the sociologist Viviana Zelizer calls hostile worlds. Modes of existence so contradictory that any contact is liable to lead to moral contamination, footnote 32. From this vantage point, to put a dollar sign on priceless aspects of nature is not only a category error, but worse, a misrecognition that threatens nature's very integrity, footnote 33. To describe invaluable things in terms of price, Robin Wall Kimmerer argues, has the paradoxical effect of cheapening them. Describe, and let me think about that again. To describe invaluable things in terms of price has the paradoxical effect of cheapening them, of demoting them from the sacred to the mundane, converting the infinite to the payable, footnote 34. Monetary value, moral critics insist, cannot possibly capture the intrinsic worth of whales as living, sentient beings. The beauty of seeing a whale breach, the status of whales as relations, or even the totality of whales' contribution to biospheric function. For many biocentric and ecocentric thinkers, economic valuation is only the most egregious form of a more foundational error. That is, the entire ecosystem services framework is ethically compromised insofar as it treats non-human beings as instrumental means to human ends. Footnote 35. Critiques of instrumental value are frequently paired with critiques of rationalization and commensurability, echoing Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment. This is a Frankfurt School critical theory. As the geographer Sean Sullivan claims, something is lost, quote, in the world-making mission to fashion and fabricate the entire planet as an abstracted plane of accountable, monetizable, and potentially substitutable natural capital. It's a lot there. Footnote 36. Anxieties about the valuation of nature that frequently echo anxieties about the effects more broadly on human political and moral subjectivity of the permeation on market logics and economic rationality into all aspects of life. Michael Sandel argues that market value crowds out other kinds of norms and valuation, diminishing other motivations for care. Footnote 37, cost-benefit analyses, John O'Neill argues, degrade politics, treating it as a surrogate market rather than a site of deliberation or contestation. Footnote 38. Now, it isn't, well, anyway, side note, it isn't that if you think of it more in Bayesian terms, but anyway, these critiques are compelling, and advocates for ecosystem services will grant many of them. Ecosystem services are recognized to be a simplifying device with well-known shortcomings. Quote, just as it would be absurd to calculate the full value of a human being on the basis of his or her wage-earning power or the economic value of his or her constituent materials, Gretchen Daly acknowledges, there exists no absolute value of ecosystem services waiting to be discovered and revealed to the world by a member of the intellectual community, close quote. Footnote 39, many see their work as a necessary evil, a last resort when appeals to nature's intrinsic value have failed. Donella Meadows, a co-author of The Limits to Growth, has argued that pricing nature is an act of ignorance and arrogance, but holds that it should be done anyway. Footnote 40. Pavan Sukhdev, the director of a major nature valuation project, describes the economic valuation of nature as, quote unquote, humanity's greatest failure, reflecting the lack of a, quote unquote, ethic of care for humans. Footnote 41. Advocates for pricing ecosystem services, however, are relentlessly pragmatic. Perhaps it is unpleasant or unwieldy to contemplate nature in terms of costs, but people already are assessing nature's value and making decisions accordingly. They simply assess its value at zero. Even rough estimates, they insist, are better than continuing to let nature count for nothing. Note the paradox there. Advocates of pricing ecosystems aren't wrong to note that nature is valued at zero by default. Contained in this statement is the recognition that the free gift of nature really does have the force of a real abstraction, and that it organizes our activity even when we are not conscious of it, and even when we are. Indeed, many critics of commodification make the mistake of identifying capitalism by the presence rather than absence of price, by the form of the commodity rather than that of the free gift. But the free gift is a form fully internal to capitalism, footnote 41. Absent a wider critique of capitalist valuation, then, the insistence that nature should remain priceless amounts to an argument that capitalism should continue treating nature as it already does. But both critics and advocates of valuing ecosystems in monetary terms have often mistaken the project of calculating values for that of assigning prices. They have tended to collapse the difference between various ways of assessing nature's economic value, treating counting, estimation, and even quantification as akin to commodification. Take, for example, the study estimating the value of the Earth's biosphere at $33 trillion. The number reflects a monumental effort to assess ecological values of all sorts, taking an ecumenical approach to 2 decades of work developing methodologies for measuring ecosystem services and compiling a wide array of valuation studies using methods ranging from assessments of people's willingness to pay to preserve beautiful landscapes to biophysical assessments of the role of various ecosystem functions to estimated costs of technological solution, footnote 43. It became quickly notorious as a reductio ad absurdum of the logic of ecosystem accounting. Who could possibly put a price on the whole Earth? But the point of calculating the value of the biosphere, its authors insisted in a subsequent paper, which also revised its estimated worth, from 33 trillion to 125 trillion, was not that the ecosystem services should actually be commodified. Rather, it was a awareness-raising exercise meant to reframe the relationship between humans and the rest of nature, footnote 44. It was, in other words, equivalent to Silvia Federici's insistence that the demand wages for housework was intended as a perspective on women's position under capitalism. Of course, it was absurd to imagine buying the entire Earth. Of course, no one was actually expected to pay 33 trillion. To the contrary, the point of the spectacular price tag was precisely that preserving free ecosystem services would cost much less than replacing them. The estimate, in other words, was not really a demand for payment, but an act of disclosure intended to draw attention to the importance of ecosystem services to human welfare and to their remarkably low cost. Relative to the alternatives, preserving nature's gifts is an incredible bargain. The difference between calculation and commodification is illustrated even more clearly by projects that seek to turn natural capital accounting to more explicitly radical ends. Natural capital accounting underpins estimates of the ecological debt incurred by the global north, which diagnose the long-standing appropriation of unvalued ecological resources from the south and critiques of ecologically unequal exchange, which charge that the long noted disparity in the terms of trade between producers of primary commodities, that is copper, iron ore, etc., and value-added commodities, that is computers, microwaves, etc., is exacerbated by the failure of prices to take the depletion of natural capital into account. Footnote 45. Natural capital accounting, in other words, has been used as a way to disclose unequal relationships between the global north and south and to animate demands for ecological reparations. As Democratic Republic of Congo President Felix Tushketi has argued Africa's ecosystems provide free crucial services to the world. African forests and oceans serve as natural carbon sinks. It is time for Africa to be compensated for the good of the continent and the planet. Footnote 46. This is a demand, effectively, of wages for oikos work. Footnote 47. As with the demand of wages for housework, however, the act of disclosure alone has been largely ineffectual. Ecosystem services remain, for the most part, as free as ever and as threatened. While tools for natural capital accounting have proliferated, they have remained largely at the level of measurement and assessment performed by multilateral institutions and non-governmental organizations. They provide advisory content, but do not actually factor into market decisions or corporate balance books. If ecological debt is increasingly acknowledged in rhetoric, it is as far as ever from being paid. Accounting for natural capital is simply not the same thing as commodifying it. Describing a watershed as a source of valuable water filtration services or estimating the cost of replacing it does not actually render it an exchangeable commodity. It does not force anyone to pay for the services that the watershed provides. Indeed, where estimations of nature's value are often seen as the first step on a steep and slippery slope to commodification, those actually trying to commodify nature have found it an uphill battle. That's put a nice way. As the Financial Times observes, setting up whales as a carbon-based asset entails several tricky steps. Footnote 48. Estimating the value of a whale, however complicated, is the easy part. Actually attaching a price to a whale is much harder. Owning nature to save it. It is not natural capital accounting, but the creation of property rights in ecosystem services that is the holy grail for many market environmentalists. The theory is that doing so will give their owners a claim to any revenues that ecosystem services generate, and hence a stake in the preservation of the ecosystem in question. This is one of the issues of, carbon capture and carbon scrubbing, whatever, by using technology. In this vision, debates about the correct way to assess nature's value are beside the point. Once property rights are assigned, nature's value doesn't need to be calculated at all. Markets will discover the right price through the regular process of exchange. See, there's already this free market thing going on in the back of some people's heads. To understand the basic idea, we can return to the Pigou Coast debate canvassed in Chapter 4. Although the smoky chimney has since become the paradigmatic illustration of the negative externality, Pigou had also mentioned a positive variation, that is, the uncompensated services of air improved by parks and forests. Footnote 49. In 1952, the economist James Mead developed this strand of Pigou's theory by considering the example of an apple farm whose trees provided a free lunch of nectar to the bee colony next door. Footnote 50. Because the apple grower was uncompensated for the services their trees provided, Mead posited, they might not produce enough blossoms to keep the bees fed, resulting in suboptimal levels of honey. Thus, the unpaid benefits the apple trees provided to the bees should be calculated. Mead suggested, and the capitalists in apple farming subsidized for the lunch they provided. Footnote 51. The Coasian counter would later come from the Chicago School economist Stephen Chung. In fact, Chung observed bees provided pollination services to apple farmers rather than the other way around, but not for free. Footnote 52. There was already a fully functioning market in pollination services. Beekeepers had been renting out beehives to farmers ever since industrially organized orchards had eradicated the non-productive weeds that attracted wild pollinators in the early 20th century. Whereas Pagovians relied on a fable of bees, Chung concluded, the facts offered evidence in support of the Coase theorem. Given adequate property rights and incentives, private actors could come to mutually beneficial agreements without government interference in prices. There was no reason to believe that similar contracts would not be created to govern other natural resources, like water and air, etc. The past 3 decades have seen numerous efforts to realize Chung's vision, whether seeking to establish companies that traffic in nature conservation, create markets in ecosystem services, biodiversity offsets, and carbon credits, or most recently to establish nature as a quote-unquote asset class. The Intrinsic Exchange Group, one self-proclaimed natural asset company, declares that nature's economy is larger than our current industrial economy, and we can tap this store of wealth. An investment reports predicts that protecting nature could generate as much as $10 trillion in business, footnote 53. Nature, another proclaims, is quote unquote the world's most undervalued asset class, footnote 54. These projects have been met with challenges in their own right, where moral philosophers have rued the imposition of economic and instrumental value on intrinsically valuable entities. Marxists have typically charged that the creation of markets in nature marks a new round of enclosure. That is, it's feudalism. Critiques in this vein frequently draw on David Harvey's concept of accumulation by dispossession. We looked at that a far piece ago. Itself, an update of Marx's analysis of so-called primitive accumulation, where Marx saw primitive accumulation as the origin of capital itself through the conversion of commonly owned assets to privately owned property. Harvey argues, following Rosa Luxemburg, that this kind of accumulation is not limited to an original moment, but constitutes a continual process. This is that dynamic and circuit thing going on. Capital repeatedly uses extra economic force to privatize resources and expel those reliant on them, thereby creating the conditions for new rounds of accumulation and staving off its own tendencies towards stagnation. The wholesale commodification of nature in all its forms, Harvey argues, is an exemplary instance of accumulation by dispossession. Following Harvey, natural capital and ecosystem service programs have frequently been described in terms of nature as accumulation strategy, accumulation by decarbonization, accumulation by conservation, neoliberal conservation, and a great expropriation of the global commons and dispossession of humanity on a scale exceeding all previous human history. Footnote 57. The geographer Neil Smith asserts that capitalism is undertaking a major strategy for ecological commodification, marketization, and financialization, which radically intensifies and deepens the penetration of nature by capital. Footnote 58. The commodification of ecosystem services, the geographer Morgan Robertson has argued, is nothing less than a step toward the monetization and financialization of the conditions of life, on par with the commodification of human labor power. Footnote 59. In the 21st century, Nancy Fraser warns, the commodification of nature has proceeded far beyond anything Polanyi imagined, extending to the likes of carbon emissions and environmental derivatives. Footnote 60. Markets in ecosystem services, many critics claim, will unleash a new wave of green grabs as capitalists buy land to speculate in newly financialized natures, in the process displacing those reliant on those ecosystems for survival. The result these accounts suggest will be a world fully owned by capital. down to the last organism and even carbon molecule. What is most striking today, however, is not the extent to which ecosystemic natures have been commodified, but the fact that they largely have not been commodified. True markets and ecosystem services have failed to materialize on a large scale, not because society has moved to counter the market, but because capitalists showed little interest other than, carbon crediting. Far from a sector worth twice global GDP, natural capital has attracted, Jessica Dempsey and Daniel Chu Suarez observe, only slivers of private investment on the order of a few $1 billion rather than the trillions of dollars imagined. Footnote 61. Private funding accounts for only 1/6 of global funding for biodiversity, conservation projects, and much of that is philanthropic. Footnote 62. The proliferation of accounting standards and even new financial instruments is not translated into actual investment. Voluntary carbon markets issue only about $2 billion in credits annually. The New York Stock Exchange recently withdrew its proposal to list natural asset companies. Footnote 63. Rather than being overwhelmed with a flood of speculative investment, conservationists rue the biodiversity finance gap. The Convention on Biodiversity has stated that private finance alone will never be sufficient for achieving biodiversity goals. Footnote 64. Even the Paulson Institute acknowledges that we, quote, we cannot rely on economic models, market forces, or the private sector alone to solve the problem of unprecedented global biodiversity loss. Footnote 65. Nature, in other words, has not appeared to be a very good accumulation strategy at all. Moral and Marxist critics of commodification, for all their differences, share a conviction that the market always moves to encompass more of the world. Capitalism relentlessly prices and commodifies, buys and sells. In search of a profit, capital stalks the whole earth, Neil Smith declares. It attaches a price tag to everything it sees, and from then on, it is this price tag which determines the fate of nature. Footnote 66. Michael Sandel similarly frets that, quote, we are moving towards a society in which everything is up for sale. Footnote 67. Pricing nature, in other words, is the default. It is what will happen if we fail to push back against the market, if we fail to actively assert that nature is valuable beyond price. But as we've seen, capital does not just advance and absorb. It also withdraws and expels, abdicates and neglects. Rather than accumulation by dispossession, ecosystem services are another instance of a different phenomenon, abdication through disinterest. And let me break here for a second and say that'd be an interesting thing to measure. A twist on the economist's fable of the bees explains why. Today, the honeybees that animated Chung's triumphant defense of property rights hardly seem like the poster child of sustainable resource management. If anything, they seem the opposite. Honeybees have, in recent years, become a high-profile example of ecological collapse. Honeybee populations have declined sharply over the past several decades as a result of pesticide use, habitat loss, and climate change, which have eliminated their source of food and made them more susceptible to diseases and parasites. And yet, while honeybees continue to die in large numbers each year, they are actually not at risk of total population collapse. Beekeepers have learned to manage the new age of habitat disruption, stress, and disease, and at least enough to maintain baseline populations. Honeybees, however, are an unusual kind of bee. They have long been domesticated, meaning that they can be physically controlled, and there are clear institutional frameworks in place designating them as property. See urban beekeeping. From the perspective of economic activity, they are essentially tiny livestock, more like cattle, pigs, and horses than wild bumblebees, wasps, or butterflies, footnote 69. They are not, in other words, representative of most ecosystem services. It is wild bees, addressed by neither Mead nor Chung, that are in more serious trouble. Wild bees are among an estimated 1,200 vertebrate and 100,000 invertebrate species worldwide, including moths, butterflies, bats, and birds that pollinate both agricultural and non-agricultural plants. The Coasian solution of property rights simply doesn't work here. Whether or not you should be able to buy the services of a wild pollinator, the fact is that you simply can't. There is no one whom you can pay to command their services and ensure that they show up on schedule. In turn, there is no one to make sure that they are fed if apple blossoms disappear, nurse them back to health when mites strike, or split the hive to help them breed. Wild hives may contribute to public benefits, but their well-being isn't directly linked to the private benefit of any individual, although you could design it that way. Anyway, even though many people have some small interest in preserving wild pollinators and the ecosystems they replenish, no one has an immediate financial interest in caring for wild pollinators themselves. It's sort of an interesting paper there. Is there a wild pollinator industry? Anyway, although some people might still do so out of personal proclivity, as in the phenomenon of pollinator gardens, this is a problem because however repugnant one finds the prospect of owning a wild bee or a whale, Chung, like Coase, isn't entirely wrong. Nature can appear in the market only where it's represented in terms of price, and hence where it is alienated as property held by a human owner. Natural communia. Natural communia. This kind of price, the price paid to the owner of natural forces or mere products of nature for the right of using those forces, it's what Marx calls rent. Rent includes the payment for things generated entirely by nature. It's paid, Marx notes, only because he is the owner of land, whether this consists of soil, forest, fish pond, waterfall, building land, or anything else. Footnote 71. Rent, in other words, reflects not the application of labor investment, but sheer control of assets. It is not a mode of accumulation, but one of distribution, a transfer of surplus value produced by one capitalist to another, the extraction of payment for gifts that once were free. Footnote 72. Rent does not then signify a new regime of accumulation rooted in the commodification of everything. It has, nevertheless, seemed like a feasible way to attach prices to ecosystem services. The problem for would-be biospheric rentiers is that the physical qualities of ecosystems tend to elude the level of control that commanding rent requires. The key difference between natural resources and ecosystem services, that is, between the figuratively priceless diamond and the literally priceless atmosphere, the honeybee and wild wasp, is that natural resources can be monopolized, alienated, and sold, while ecosystem services, by and large, cannot. Footnote 73. Many features of ecosystems and the contributions they make to our lives and economies are not easily captured by private property. Some are too mobile to enclose, right? Air circulates, birds migrate, right? Whales migrate, whatever. Others are not mobile enough. You can pick an apple from a tree, ship it around the world, but you can't harvest and transport the shade its leaves provide, nor can you store it up to use later. Like human services, ecosystem services last only as long as they are actively being produced, and most are produced only as long as they exist in relation to one another. Natural resources are discrete objects and entities that can be extracted or closed off from broader ecological and social relations. Ecosystem services, by contrast, exist only in a web of relationships from which they can't be isolated or extracted. The useful services they provide emerge from their very life processes and their interactions with one another. So if you put a whale in an aquarium tank, it may provide human entertainment and even existence value, but it won't feed ocean dwellers or stimulate phytoplankton growth. Footnote 74. And this is kind of important. Physical obstacles to ownership are not necessarily insuperable. This, after all, is what property rights are for, asserting a claim to things that can't be secured through physical control alone. Financialization, in particular, has been seen as one way to make ecosystems saleable, a way to abstract away from entities that remain stubbornly concrete. Elements of ecosystems can be represented as buyable units in the abstract, remember, carbon auctions. Whether or not those representations adequately represent the underlying ecosystems. Perhaps you can't buy the tree's carbon sequestration services directly, but you can buy a carbon credit. Footnote 75. In contrast to gifts of nature that are easily appropriated, however, like the apple that Locke's labor plucks from a common orchard, the process of making ecosystem services into commodities is elaborate. Ecosystems must be mapped, their services identified, their contributions measured. A gigantic apparatus must be constructed to assess and verify whether these abstractions are really representing the physical activities they claim to be. This is where, geostatistics can come in. Perhaps the biggest problem, however, comes from creating demand for gifts of nature that give too freely. While an instrument might be designated to represent a unit of carbon, it can't become a commodity unless those who don't pay can be excluded from using it. Footnote 76. That some natural entities preclude such exclusion has long been noted. In the 6th century, the Roman Emperor Justinian had declared that, quote, by the natural law itself, the following are common to all: air, running water, and the sea, and with it the shores of the sea. Footnote 77. A millennium later, the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius concluded of the free sea that nature commandeth it should be common. 4 centuries after Grotius, the economist J.H. Dales noted, quote, about the only things in this world that are not owned in any meaningful sense are the high seas and their animal inhabitants, which were owned in common because there is no alternative, unquote. Footnote 78. In 1932, the legal scholar Samuel Wheel named air, running water, and by extension oil and gas, sea and seashores to be elements wherein communal ownership was compelled by natural necessity, describing them in terms of, quote unquote, natural communism. Footnote 79. As the lineage dating to Justinian suggests, the physical properties of these natural agents and the obstacles they present to certain forms of human use have not themselves changed. They've taken on significance with the emergence of capitalism, however. By now, nearly everything that can be enclosed has been, and those that cannot stand out all the more starkly. Not only air and sea, but most ecosystem services are best characterized by J.B. Say's, Jean-Baptiste Say's observation that, quote, the wind turns our mills, and even the heat of the sun cooperates with human industry. But happily, no man has ever been able to say, the wind and the sun rays are mine, and I will be paid for their productive services, unquote. Footnote 80. But remember, of course, that big, there's a Simpson episode with a big umbrella to block out the sun, I think. Anyway, because Montgomery Burns had designed it or had it built, whatever. The term capital itself was originally used to describe heads of cattle. But cattle, like honeybees, are ownable, alienable, exchangeable, precisely what ecosystem services are not. Natural capital, then, is a misnomer. Ecosystem services are better described as natural communia. Natural communia, the Latin term for property held by all. Darn communism. In neoclassical economics, these kinds of entities are typically known as public goods. One person can use them without preventing anyone else from doing so, and no one can be stopped from using them. While pure public goods can't be depleted, many other ecosystem services fall into the related category of quote-unquote common pool goods. That is, goods that can eventually be exhausted, but that it is difficult to prevent others from using. In fact, it is only recently that the atmosphere itself has come to appear more like soil fertility than like sunlight, as something that human use could substantially alter or diminish. From the perspective of an economist, the Anthropocene might be thought of as the shift of many goods from the status of public goods to common pool goods. The realization that public activity and use can change and consume goods once thought immutable and indestructible. Now, while the generosity of the unowned wind and sun was, for say, a happy fact, for economists it is a problem. It is precisely because of the abundant generosity of these public goods that they are often underprovided. No one has a financial incentive to provide these goods if they cannot change others to use them or prevent non-payers from benefiting. Cans of air. Footnote 81. Ecosystems, of course, provide themselves, but no one will bear the opportunity costs of ecosystems conservation, the costs of, say, preserving a wetland instead of turning it into a housing development, if they can't prevent others from paying for them in turn. To put it simply, why buy the ecosystem when you can get the service for free? As the natural capital economist Dieter Helm has bluntly observed, no private company is going to get into this business. Footnote 82. Are ecosystems thereby safe from the annihilating force of the market? Hardly. In a world where most things are commodities and natural communia are under threat, not from enclosure, but from erosion. This is, of course, the basic insight of Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, which claims that things that aren't owned will be destroyed. Hardin, as we've seen, treats the commons as a timeless phenomenon rooted in the simple fact of material scarcity. Contra Hardin, however, this tragedy arises not from the sheer fact of common property, but from the fact that the commons today exist as patches of recalcitrant matter within a highly commodified world. And of course, no comment on Hardin's own racism. But anyway, this tragedy, in other words, is one generated by market rule, footnote 83. And yet, the state of natural communia within capitalism stands a challenge, too, for Hardin's critics, from Eleanor Ostrom to Peter Linebaugh, who counter that commons are typically governed according to internal rules and norms, footnote 84. Now, while these scholars have tended to address the commons as an institutional form that can be studied in isolation or as alternatives to the market altogether, the fact is that market rule will weigh on any commons, however well governed internally, that isn't entirely self-sufficient. There are no historical precedents, moreover, for the management of planetary commons, like the atmosphere and the oceans, and no way for smaller scale commons to escape their planet-making force. In other words, the commons cannot really be understood apart from state and market, as Ostrom suggests, let alone in opposition to them, as Linebaugh claims. Against the view that capitalism is equivalent to privatization, capitalism's social relations fundamentally structure even the commons. Surplus and objection. Now, we're on page 196, and I think we're up to it. There's another 10 pages, I think, to the end. Yes, at 206. So we have 10 more pages. I've already hit the limit of my time, and I guess I'll discuss that anon. So tomorrow, we'll do the last 10 pages of this little piece here. And I hope you can remember some of the issues that are important here. This is a very good chapter because it does parse out some of the underlying issues of making a contrast between what counts as commons, communism, and communia as a new way of talking about it. So all those are important. So I will shut off the live stream.